Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be.
Hello, everyone. It is I, Patrick. Today, I'm doing a solo episode. And the reason I'm doing a solo episode is because Kylene is resting her vocal cords. So she's in here, and I'm really nervous about it. So please help me through this. Just kidding. She's in here, but she's resting her vocal cords because she's what I would call starring. She may not call it starring, but she's starring in a musical and has been rehearsing. So she's giving her vocal cords a rest. So today I'm going to spend the time talking about healthy mindsets for recovery. You know, a lot of this betrayal and discovery and understanding that you're a sex addict and taking a categorization or a catalog of everything that you've done is not a fun process. And as you work through that, you can really get down. And so my plan is to walk through 5 things that I think from an attitude standpoint or a perception or a belief that you can adopt and that will help you move forward in your healing journey. And understand that, you know, through the pain of recovery and the pain of reconciliation in your relationships that might become hard to do this every minute and every hour of every day. But I think it's a good list that you can return yourself to and say, okay, how am I doing relative to this list? I do a lot of leadership coaching as well. And this is something that seems to help in that as well. Because not every organization always runs well all the time. And sometimes you have to really deal with some big problems and work on change and develop contingencies to get out of a problem situation. So this is very similar to that in a lot of ways. So the other thing I also want to say is I am in no way saying that you're not responsible for your behavior. And there's always consequences, both good and bad, to what we do. So, you know, a good example is relapse. So just because you relapse through your recovery process doesn't mean you aren't ultimately going to meet your goal of recovery, but it could come with consequences. And so, you know, it's always important to recognize that from a factual basis that, yes, I relapsed. Yes, I'm still working on recovery. Yes, I'm responsible for that behavior that happened and whatever consequence comes from that. So it's important to just keep that in mind as I walk through this. So I think the first one I'm going to talk to is developing a mindset of I'm going to beat this. So whether you're discovered or, which happens to a lot of us, certainly happened to me, and I'm not proud of that. Or you just decide at some point and have enough willpower in that moment that you're going to start the moment of healing. It's important to know that I'm going to beat this. So if you think about it, and I will draw some analogies through each of these when I talk about them. You know, when you sign up for let's say a couch to 10K or couch to 5K or a half marathon and stuff, when you sign up for those programs, you have a belief that you are going to end that program running a 5K or running a 10K or doing whatever that is. Same thing when you start your road to recovery. A lot of times, and I remember this myself, this was actually something that I was able to hold quite well through the process, was this belief that I was going to heal. I didn't tie it to my relationship with Kylene. I didn't say I'm going to heal for Kylene. I wanted to heal for her. I certainly wanted to make sure that we could reconcile and stay together. But I figured out very early on that this was a sickness that affected me, and the collateral damage affected our relationship. So I knew that I was going to beat this, and I was going to find the tools that I needed. I was going to make the efforts that I needed. So I was lucky. I was able to carry that belief coming in, and it did sustain me through some of the very dark times. And you know, I'll be honest, I have been able. I'm a pretty determined guy. at times, or in most of my life with certain things. But for those of you who struggle with that, one of the things that I would recommend is that you write it down. Write down. Sometimes it's amazing how much of a vision cast that can do for you. You write down on a piece of paper and tape it to your mirror in your above your vanity that says, "I am going to heal. I am going to beat this," or I am no longer a sex addict." Something like that. That's a positive that you can look to during the dark times, because it is hard. Sometimes you don't feel like you're going to make it. Sometimes you feel, you spend that first 2 weeks and being like, "Yeah, I'm not doing this anymore," and all of a sudden maybe the temptations start to return, and you go, "Oh my gosh, I thought that I was on this road where I was going to start to recover," and so you're a little confused because you haven't learned everything yet. So sometimes those statements can help you, and even to that point, you can pass that off to maybe a friend or an accountability partner, or in a situation, maybe your betrayed spouse acts as a friend and kind of helps you through that and say, "Hey, you ask this person, you say, 'Hey, when I'm feeling down, if you could just remind me that I'm going to beat this.'" And I think that would be a very effective way to keep this front and center in your mind. And so I think taking a positive statement, and whether you got to fake it, sometimes you got to fake it till you make it. But just ultimately, you'll start to have that belief that you are going to beat this. And I think sometimes when I look at, and I work with certain men who continually kind of fall back into it, I don't believe they have a general belief of getting from point A to point B. And I think it's part of something that self-sabotages them at times. So think about that. How could you maintain that belief out there that you are going to recover? It's a long process. 3 to 5 years is a long time. In most cases, I think outside of college is 4 years long. Maybe a master's program, those are 3 years long. So those, things that take time, that take steps here and there, sometimes you can lose the belief in where you're going. So that's why it's always important to have reminders. The second mindset that I believe is very helpful, and this is actually one, and I'll give the example where that Kylene gave to me at one point that really, really has helped me, and I've shared it as often as I can with the groups that I lead. But it's understanding what you are or aren't going to do and can and can't do, and stated as such. So that's a little complicated what I just said, but let me give you the best example that I think I have out there. So a lot of times folks will say, "Well, I can't look at porn anymore." So that's a statement, and it's good and it's factual, and you don't want to look at porn anymore, but you want to shift that from "I can't look at porn" to what I just said, "I don't look at porn." So there is a difference there. So "I can't look at porn" means like you're in a cell and nobody will let you out to look at porn, versus "I don't look at porn" means that you are walking along, let's say, with the opportunity to do something inappropriate, and you don't take that opportunity. You are in control versus somebody else controlling you. So that's a really powerful kind of reframe on the behavior. So if you think about it, the statement "I don't look at porn" or "I don't act out sexually," that's ultimately what you wanted to be before you had to get into this process, or before you were discovered. So it does demonstrate a greater control or belief in your ability to navigate life and the twists and turns of life and the pains of life. One of the other things that I will hear we talked last episode about or the last couple episodes about journaling, is I will hear guys say all the time, "I'm just not a good journaler." Well, as opposed to saying I'm not a good journaler, what about saying something like, I don't journal very often, but I'd like to learn how to journal more. So there's a difference in how you're saying it. So all of these things are good as far as casting back to that vision of "I'm going to beat this." You've got to kind of develop a different way of speaking to yourself through this. And that's why this is a healthy mindset. One of the things that I say in both my workplace, my professional setting, and this is when you carry on and on about how hard things are going to be, well, they end up being pretty hard. So if you carry on and on about, oh my gosh, I can never find accountability software or things that'll lock down my computer, it's really hard to do that. If you just carry on and on all the time about how hard that is, well, it's going to be really hard to do it versus, hey, I'm going to find the right software. I'm going to find the time to journal. I'm not going to, I don't look at pornography. I'm going to give my wife my phone. Like those, if you just take those positive steps and change and shift the way you're doing, as opposed to coming at it from a negative mindset all of the time, it's going to be harder. I'm actually, it's interesting because you'll see organizations go through this, and I'm shifting away from sex addiction for a while. And they will believe wholeheartedly that their situation is the most complex thing, is the hardest thing that anybody has ever faced in the history of humanity. And when they have that mindset, it limits your range of motion. It limits your ability to move forward and start to find solutions. Because at the end of the day, maybe it is the most obtuse situation that you've ever been in. But so what? Find a way to move forward. So same thing with this. Maybe you aren't a journaler. Maybe, I've actually seen some folks that actually have trouble writing because of various, let's say, disabilities, but they find ways to do like text to talk or talk to text or whatever to get the journaling in. Some people just move through those obstacles and they find a way to get it done. So I think that's a big one there, is understanding what you are or aren't going to do and can and can't do, and state it as such, with the great example of I can't look at porn, which is bad, versus I don't look at porn, which is a much more positive way to say it. The third one I would say is speak kindly to yourself. This is really, really hard. Shame, the shame of what we've done. And I struggled with this for a long time. I remember the one thing I would say was, I am a bad husband. I'm just a bad husband. And I had this sense of, I had gotten in this car accident in my first marriage, and then in my second marriage, I had cheated on my spouse, and I was like, I'm just a bad husband. I'm not a good husband. And that's not speaking very kindly to myself. It doesn't take into account all the times that I have been present, all the times that I put in the effort, all the times that I was there. If you speak factually about it, hey, I was working very hard with what I knew to be present for Kylene, to be available, but I fell short, and I actually cheated on her. I was unfaithful through my sex addiction, but now I'm working really hard to make amends. And so there is a difference there. And sometimes, what prevents us, sometimes people have spent their whole life speaking negatively to themselves, that it has become a brain pattern, much like the addiction is. And it's going to take some real hard work to get you to start speaking positively about yourself. It is not an easy thing to do. Sometimes you will hear people use self-deprecating humor, and they'll use it all the time. That is a good example of somebody who speaks negatively of themselves. Sometimes maybe a little self-deprecating. Well, that was a dumb decision, or boy, that wasn't very graceful, or something like that. In a small moment, sometimes can be good, because it is important to laugh at yourself. But when you're constantly using that to put yourself down, the deal is your body listens. Your body can hear it, and you create those negative self patterns. The one thing that actually helps in this is to speak factually about yourself. So, and I mentioned it a little bit with my situation. So, the first thing is, I had a sex addiction. That sex addiction, I kept a secret from Kylene. Through that, I manipulated the truth as it related to sex addiction. And I was unfaithful to her through that. And I provided for the family financially. I worked very hard. I was present for my son at all of his events. So like that's just speaking factually about what I've done and what I haven't done. So that's important to do. Now, listen, I think what's really important to this is, on the day you get discovered, this would probably not be a good thing to start throwing at your spouse how factually great you are. That's probably the day to be quiet a little bit. Don't go into this long tirade about, yes, but remember the one time I polished your shoes and I went and got the groceries. upon discovery early on, this is how you speak to yourself, not necessarily how you're speaking to your betrayed spouse. If positive self-belief is going to help with the notion of I'm going to beat this as well. So it's important to get in there and really take time and catalog some of the positive things you are. So, this really kind of re-highlights the difference between shame and guilt. So shame is I'm a bad person. As I just discussed before, I'm a bad husband. That's shame. Guilt is I did a really bad thing in this relationship. I kept a secret from my wife. I thought I could handle it on my own. I didn't allow her to bring her strengths to bear and help me through this process. However, I have, now I am trying very hard to make amends. Once again, you kind of start to speak factually about things versus I am just a bad person through and through. I deserve no grace. I deserve no help. And so those are just really negative patterns to do. So think about that in your own life. And one of the best ways to do this is two ways. Number one, listen to how you talk about yourself. How does that come up? How do you react when you are being criticized? Do you listen without emotion? Are you able to fully understand what's being said to you? Maybe in the hard moment when your wife is saying, I can't believe you did that. Do you look her in the eye and listen and empathize? Or do you drop your head and do you say, yeah, you're right, I'm a horrible person? Like, how do you respond to that? That's a good way to do that. The second thing would be to actually enlist those around you and say, hey, how do I talk about myself? Maybe your children, maybe grown children. You don't want to ask your 3-year-old to ask, hey, say, how do I talk about myself? Your betrayed spouse, when you all get to a point where it looks like there's some progress in healing, ask your spouse, how do I talk to myself? How do I describe myself? Do I describe myself as somebody who is healing, who is trying to get better, or do I just describe myself as this horrible, horrible person? So, because your body is going to listen. So try to do your best to speak kindly to yourself. The fourth thing would be curious. Sex addiction is something that people don't, until you get discovered or until you determine that you are a sex addict, nobody's doing any research on it. Unless maybe you're a therapist going through this and you have a therapist or a coach and you just have a heart for it and you want to learn more about it. Normally, like in our case, in Kylene, in my case, we didn't know anything about it. I was discovered. I wanted to learn everything I could about it because I didn't want this to be part of my life anymore, as did she. So we got books, we started reading, we started listening to podcasts, and there's some great podcasts out there. Hint, hint, ours. There's another one called Pure Desire. We've talked about that before. These are great resources for everyone out there. And they talk about things that you need to hear. What is the process? What are the tools? What are the things that you kind of need to rehear on occasion as well? It's really, really important. And it's nice to have, the nice thing with podcasts is they come out on a relative periodic basis. So you can listen to those things and have them come up again. Don't be afraid to get books. There's a lot of resources out there. And all you got to do is Google it. And, Dr. Patrick Carnes is a great resource. He's got a lot of great stuff out there. But you can spend time on the Soul Refiner website. You can spend time on the Pure Desire website. There's just so many resources out there that spend some time, get out there and be curious. Think about it this way. And I think this is sometimes things we don't do because it's such a private thing and we don't want to talk about it. But, God forbid your parent, one of your parents or one of your loved ones gets diagnosed with cancer. A lot of us are hitting Google and we're starting to understand that, my mother had cancer, and her cancer was neuroendocrine tumors. I had never heard that phrase before. I Googled it. I joined a Facebook group about neuroendocrine tumors. It's funny. I never unfollowed it. It still pops up on occasion. But the same thing with this, get into, SA. What's SA? Go look it up. Look for people to go talk to. And as we've talked about before, the first group you get into where you're learning more may not be the ultimate group you are in, but spend that time. Be curious. If you want to go become a private pilot, you go research it. So this is no different. And it's really, really important because this is going to consume the major portion of your life over the next year, 2, 3 years as you're recovering. It's that important. And so take the time to do that. And you can message Kylene or drop some comments in the comments page about, hey, what are some additional resources? And we'd love to put those in there. But it is a hard. It's not out in the mainstream, as we all know. If you found this podcast, it wasn't out in the mainstream. But there are a lot of resources out there. So be very curious, take the time and spend the time that you need to learn more about why you're there. Where did the sex addiction come from? What are some ways to healing? What's the track of healing? What are some good things to do in relation to your spouse who has been betrayed? How do you go about that process? So just take that time and be studious to that end. The final thing I would say is to go one step at a time. This is a long, long process. And I was actually listening to another podcast where a betrayed spouse was talking, and she was like, sometimes I had to go hour by hour and just to kind of understand what my emotions were. And I think in this podcast, she had talked about her daughter asked if dad had sex with somebody else. And she said no. And it was just, she said that. She was like, I was just trying to figure it out. From one day to the next. It's the same thing with this thing. You're not going to do everything right. You may show up wonderfully one day and you may show up horribly the next day. It would be great if all you can do is just flip a switch, but an addiction is just that. It's not something that goes away that quickly. You've really got to spend some time on it. There's a lot of things out there. How to eat the elephant one bite at a time. How do what do you do when you're stuck in somewhere bad? You keep moving. There's a lot of great statements out there, but understand this is a 3 to 5 year process. And you just have to know that it's not going to go quickly. So just because you have a blocker now on your phone doesn't mean you're healed. Just because you go 90 days doesn't mean you're healed. Just because maybe your spouse turns to you and says, after you all have gone through therapeutic disclosure and says, okay, never want to talk about it again, you just do your healing, doesn't mean you're healed. You just have to keep going. You have to understand and understand 3 to 5 years with some possible debris that you're cleaning up from time to time throughout the year. So, I'm getting very close to 3.5 years. It's very exciting, but I also feel like, as much as I would love to have my evenings back from running groups and things like that on occasion, it's something I want to stay engaged in because I feel like, and Kylene will say this to me. She's like, sometimes hearing you talk about it, the depth of how you talk about it changes each time. And that's just part of that growth process. So I encourage you to keep going when things are hard, point to the other 4 things that I've talked about, but keep going. It's going to take time and you have to understand that. So maybe when you start, the first thing I talked about is I'm going to beat this. Maybe the phrase that you attach to this, but it will take a long time. So that way it just keeps reminding you that the euphoria you feel at 90 days and your wife turns to you and says, well, congratulations, you didn't spend 90 days cheating on me. And you're like, hey, wait a minute, but that's just part of that process. It's going to take time. And so think about it. If you've ever had somebody betray your trust, not in a sex addiction kind of way, but maybe a friend that talked about you behind your back or whatever, how hurt you felt, that's the kind of hurt magnified that your spouses or significant others are going through. So, you may find some individual healing, but your relational healing is going to take even longer. And so just understand that sometimes if we know what we're dealing with, then it's easier to understand the twists and turns, the ups and downs, the lefts and rights that come through a process. So that's my final thing. So just to or my final healthy mindset. So just to reiterate them, number 1, develop a mindset of I am going to beat this, and understand that you might have to fake it before you make it, but write it down, get it out there. Second is understanding what you are or aren't going to do and can and can't do and state it as such. So once again, the example is I can't look at porn versus the more healthy, I don't look at porn. Third is speak kindly to yourself. Pay attention to how you're describing yourself to others and to yourself. You are part of what has led us here is shame. And if you speak negatively to yourself, that's just reinforcing that shame message. The fourth one is be curious. Spend time learning about this. There's tons of resources out there. We'd love to share those with you, and we have over our last so many podcasts. Finally, understand that it's going to take one step at a time. This is a journey. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint, and it's just going to take a lot of time to get there. So thanks. I hope that these are helpful to you, and we will talk to you next time.
Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.